Hello everyone and welcome back to this session on Blue Prism. In this module, I'm going to talk about case management. In Blue Prism, we have a concept of work queues. So work queues, they hold items in them and any process can reach out to these work queues and extract or fetch these items from the queue, work on those items, and once they are done with those items, they can mark them complete, or if while processing some error occurs, they can mark them as exceptions, or maybe they can even defer them back to the queue for later processing. So because of these work queues, we can have multiple processes working on the same queue at the same time, where each process is retrieving a different case to work with. These work queues can be monitored and maintained from the control room. So if we have a lot of cases for a single process to work with, what we can do is uh, we can we can create multiple sessions uh, of that process on several machines, and each of those process is talking to that same work queue. So in this way, we can get the load balancing. So work queue provides us the functionality to store, manage, share, and report on the process work. Or in other words, a work queue is an internal configurable list which enables a process to manage its workload. A process can use either different work queues, or a work queue can be shared by multiple processes if required. So we see our work queues inside the control room. Under control room, we have the queue management tab where we have the queues listed over here in the top half, and in the bottom half, if we select any particular queue, we can see the items within that queue. So let's create a queue. To create a queue, we go to the system manager, and under there, under workflow, we have work queues, and here let me call this queue1. Field key name, I'll give it as account ID. So key name is the field in my data which is which is going to appear in my queue. So if you have multiple rows in my data, then only the key name, whichever field I'm marking as key name, will the data from that field would be appearing in the queue. Other data from the other fields will not be visible. So I'll just keep other things at default, and would create this queue by clicking this apply button. So the queue has been created. Now if I go to the control room and go to the queue management tab, I can see that the queue has been created for me, though there are 0 items in this queue. Now we'll add some item to that queue. So to do that, I have already created this process called load queue. When I open it, within this process, I have a collection over here called queue data, which has 5 rows in it. Let me show it to you. Uh, this collection has 2 fields, account ID and node. If you remember, account ID was the key name that I had given when I was creating the queue, as and under initial values, I can see that I have 5 rows over here. Uh, so I have this thing, and now I'll click OK. Now to add this data to the queue, I have used an action stage. So here's the action stage. I use that stage. If I open it, within this action stage, I'm using the business object called work queues. So this business object is available to us from Blue Prism. It's an internal business object, though you would see that you cannot see this business object here in this list, but it's available to us, work queues. And the action that I'm going to use is add to queue. You can read the documentation of this business object and this particular action by clicking this view documentation button, which will open it in the browser, and you can read about the inputs, the description of this action, and the description of the inputs that this action take and the output that it returns. So here I'm putting some data in Q1. So this was the name of my queue, and the data that I'm putting it is is available to me within this collection called queue data. So if I expand this collection, here's the data that I have available: queue data.account ID, queue data.node. So So that collection name I have put over here. Then what it is returning me, it will return me a collection of item IDs. This has 5 rows in it, so it will return me 5 item IDs to me. If interested, we can even store that, but right now that's not required, so I will leave that as is. And I will click OK over here. So we will run this. This will add these 5 rows to my queue. So let's run this and let's close this. I need to save. And if I go to my control room, go to my queue, I can see that this queue now has 5 items within it. These queue, these items, they have uh, 3 dots before them, which are ellipses. So these ellipses show that these items are in the pending state. When I hover my mouse, I can see this is in a pending state. Okay, now we will see how we can work on these items in our queue. So what we'll do is we'll create a process, and I'll call this process queue exercises 1. And in this process, we'll take an action stage, open it. We'll call this get next item from the queue. Business object that we are going to use will be our work queues, and action would be get next item. So it needs some inputs, queue name, which is a mandatory input. So I need to provide my queue name. Q1 was my queue name. The other inputs are optional. And then under outputs, I'm going to retrieve everything. So I'll create data items for each of them. So I've created 4 data items that will store the values that is returned from these outputs. Let me click OK. Okay. So and I will link them together. Let's reset and run it. So it returns me the first available item from that queue. You can see the item ID for this, which is GUID, and then it returns me some data, row 1 of 1. If I open this collection, even though I didn't create any fields for this collection, but if I go to current values, I can see that it fetched me the row for this ID 012341 with note AAA. So if I go to my control room and open up my Q1, I can see that for the first row in that queue, we have a padlock before it, which says that this case has been locked. So a process is already working on this case. Now we will see how we can mark these items in our queue as completed. Let's go back to our studio, process studio. Here we'll take another action, open it. We'll call this mark completed. Business object would be our work queues, and action would be mark completed. So it take an input of item ID. So we got the item ID from the action called get next item. At that time we got this particular item ID. So we'll use that item ID. It should be under text. So I drag and drop that item ID under value, and we are passing it. Let's see any output. It's not giving me any output, but it takes an input of item ID. So which item in my queue it has to mark complete? The item which has the item ID of this will be marked as completed. So I click on OK. I will link this within my flow, and uh, I'll make this as my stage to run. So I'll say set this as my next stage, and then we'll run this. So if I go back to my control room and refresh this queue, you can see right now the icon is lock padlock. When I refresh it, the icon changes to a tick mark which says that this item has been now completed. Now we will see that while processing an item from the queue, if something goes wrong, we can mark that item as an exception. So here I'll reset my process, and instead of mark completed, I'll say mark as exception, and the action that we will choose would be mark exception. Okay. So it takes an item ID as an input, which is like which item has to be marked as exception. Then exception reason, why we are causing it, making this as an exception. Demo to show exceptions. So any outputs, it return me the new item ID. I don't need that. So I'll just click OK, and we'll rerun this process, reset and rerun. So it gets me the next item, and it will mark that as an exception. So if I go to my control room and refresh my queue, you can see that the next item has now been in an exception state. And when I scroll right, I can see under exception reason, I have the string that I had set as the demo to show exceptions. Okay, let me now show you how we can schedule two processes that work on the same queue, and what happens to the items in the queue. So I'll go to my process, and I will create a copy of it, and I'll call it queue exercises 1A. Click next, finish, close this. Now let me go to my studio, and I'll refresh, open both these processes, both 1 and 1A, and go to my control room under Q1. Now we have three items, and let's see which process does what. So I will first run this process, also go to the other one, run it. Now go back to the first one, step through it, and if I refresh this, I see an item has been locked. Now I'll go to the other one, step through this one, and refresh, and I should see next item being locked by that process. So these two processes are working on separate items. Let's now see how we work through all the items in a queue. So I'll go to my process studio, open up the process, and here what we'll do is, once we have got the next item, or maybe let's first change this. Instead of mark as exception, we'll say mark as completed, and we'll use the action mark completed. Let's see, okay, and click on OK. So once we have mark completed, we need to go and get the next item. So we'll take anchor stages. Anchor stages are used for drawing links. These are inert stages. They don't do anything. So they're just used for connecting the links. And but this looks like to be an infinite loop. We need to somewhere check if we got the next item or not. So to do that, we need to take a decision stage where we will check for the item that we have retrieved or not. So we'll check got the item, and we'll take the item ID, and we'll say this should not be empty. If this is not empty, we know we have got the item. Okay, click OK, and we'll so we'll get, after get next item, we'll come to got item, and if that item is there, we'll go to mark completed. If item is not there, then we need to go to end. Let me rearrange some of these stages. Okay, so here we are checking for the next item. If it is available, that we'll check by this condition. If it is available, we'll mark it as completed and go and get the next item and keep on doing it. Once we reach the end of the list in the queue, we can stop this process. Before I run this, I need to replenish my queue. So let me go to load queue and run this once more. Now going to my control room, going back to my queue. I have some items and use my process. So let me have these things side by side. Okay, so I'll run this and I'll refresh my queue. So you can see it got the next item. I'll keep refreshing so that you can see the progress. And once the last item is worked upon, it will stop. So this is the last item and it takes an end. When we are adding items to the queue, it is possible to prevent these items from being worked too soon. That we can do by providing a deferral date. And until that deferral date is reached, the queue will not return those items to any process that's requesting an item from it. Effectively, the items are temporarily frozen. So if I go to my process which was loading into the queue, here in the add to queue action, we have a input called defer until, and it needs a date time. So let's provide this defer until. We'll say here we have some date function. So I'll say now plus make time span. Let me maximize this and I want to defer until uh, maybe for the next 5 minutes. Paste. Okay, so this will defer until the 5 minutes from now. Click OK. Run this. Close this. Going back to the control room. When I go to my queue, I have some 5 items added, but they have this column next review updated, which shows that they cannot be worked until 11:02 a.m. So it's as per my current system time, it is 5 minutes from now. So let's run our process, reset, and they shouldn't get anything from the queue. Even though there are items, but we couldn't get it because uh, the deferred time has not yet reached. So we see it's every time going to the end. We can also manually override the defer date. So from the control room, let's say if I want to defer this particular item, I can right click and click on change deferral date. Here we can change the date. Let's make it 11:10, or we can even type over here. Let this be 11:10 50 seconds. Click OK, and we can see the deferred date has been changed. There's another way of deferring the items. That is, once we have retrieved the items from the queue and we are half done with that item, we can defer it back to the queue. So that will release the item back to the queue. It will not mark it as completed or as an exception, and any other process will be able to get that item once that deferred time has reached. So to do that, if I go to my process studio, here instead of mark as completed, I will say mark as deferred and choose the action as defer. So here it takes an additional input called until, and we'll give that same kind of an expression. We'll say now plus make time span, and we'll add a time span of 0 days, 0 hours, 0 maybe 5 minutes, and or let's say I'll make it an 1 hour. I'll defer it for 1 hour and paste it. Click OK and OK over here. So it will defer it for 1 hour once it has caught from the queue. Let me restore this, and if I run this, I'll pause it once it has deferred and refresh this one, reset, and we can see that one of the item, this one, has the deferred time 1 hour from now. So one thing we saw when we ran this exercise was that these 5 rows were deferred, but I could get this particular row because the deferred time had reached. Now if I will run that process again, it will be able to get one of these 4 rows, most probably this one, because this was inserted first, and should be able to process it since this next review time or the deferred time is in the past. When an item causes an exception and it's returned back to the queue, that item is not retrieved from the queue again. That's because when we were creating the queue, we left the max attempts field as the default of 1. However, if we change that value, if we make it a value higher than 1, then it means that if exception happens on that on any item in the queue, then we can take an attempt at that item by the number which we have set when creating that queue for max attempts field. Blue Prism will revive any exception cases by cloning a new item and will insert it back into the queue. So let's do one thing. We'll go to our queue definition, and here we'll change the max attempts field to 2. Click apply to save our changes. Now if I go back to my queue, I don't see any visible change. If I go back to my process, let me reset this. Instead of mark as deferred, I'll say mark as uh, exception, and I'll choose mark exception reason demo on max attempts. Click OK. Now if I run this, and let me restore this, refresh, so I can see that this particular item has been marked as an exception, and I also see that another row by that same key has been added to it. So that item has been cloned by Blue Prism. So we still have 5 things to work. However, if I run it one more time, first let me pause and refresh and see which item is being worked upon. Okay, so it's working on the next item. Let me run this. And let me refresh. Okay, so this time you see the one which was having exception has been returned back to the uh, process. The same item has been locked because maximum attempts was 2. So if it will fail this time, then we will not see a clone of this particular key. We can see a clone of 1 2 3 4 3 over here, uh, but but after this we will not see a clone of this one. So let me run this and show you that. So I'll pause, refresh, and I don't see now 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2 in my list. Okay, and if I'll run it one more time, refresh my queue, and I can see that this time it's working on the clone of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 3. So only 2 attempts would be taken for each item that is causing an exception. One thing that we can do when we are having exceptions is, let me uh, open this, is we have this retry flag which says whether or not we would like to retry the item up to the number of maximum attempts. So by default this is true, and if I set it to false, it will not be allowing retries on those items. So if I click OK on it, this one, it will, anyway this was the last attempt, but maybe for the next item we can see. Okay, I'll refresh. So I have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, and once it will cause an exception, it will not keep a clone even though maximum attempts has been set to 2, because we had set the flag as false here in this action stage. So I'll run this and refresh, and I see I do not have a clone for 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 because we set that flag as false. When we are causing exceptions on the items in the queue and are marking them as exceptions, if more retries are left and we would like to immediately get that same item to process it further, we can make use of the keep locked input parameter. So here inside our process studio, I'll open up this mark X exception, and we have this input called keep locked. So if I set retry as true and keep locked, its default value is false, but I make this as true. Now what will happen is it will mark it as exception, and the new copy that we get will it will also create a new copy and will return that same copy back to us, which we can get inside the new item ID, and we can save that maybe under the item ID thing itself, so so that the next time we can work on it. So let me just show you this. I will reset. Let me refresh my queue. I hope I have some items. Yeah, I have 2 items in it. So if I'll run this and see which one item I have retrieved. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 has come. Let me run this and mark it as an exception. So marking as exception will mark this as an exception. If I refresh, okay, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 was marked as exception, but another clone was created and that has been locked by this particular process. Uh, so once we have the item ID, using that item ID, we can we can fetch the data using that item ID. Okay, so we can continue working on that same item even after an exception has happened on it. We can also pause our queue, and when the queue is paused and we run our process, then even though the items would be available in that queue, they won't be returned to the process. So right now we have this queue as running, so I'll right click and we'll pause this queue. Now this queue has been paused and there are some items in it, but when I run this process, I should not get anything back from it. Okay, so it ends thinking that there is nothing in the queue. Now if I resume this by right clicking and saying resume selected queues, and this time if I run this process, I should be able to get something back from it. So this completes the module, and in this module we saw that how we can use a queue to manage a workload, and the work is stored as a list of individual items within the queue. We have a business object available from Blue Prism that is used to work with the queue item, and each item in the queue is actually a collection of data that can be used by the process. And when that item is being worked by the process, it is locked to ensure that no 2 processes are working on the same item. After we are done with an item in the queue, we can either mark it as complete or as an exception, or even defer it back to the queue. We can also set the maximum attempts to be a value higher than 1, that will cause any exception items to be worked again. We can also deactivate a queue by pausing it and reactivate it once we want it to return the items back to the processes.